are deeply honored and pleased that From Here to Equality, Reparations of Black American Descendants of U.S. Slavery was selected for the Lillian Smith Award. It's really special, and we're extremely grateful to have been selected. You know, just a little something about, Lillian Smith herself, this tireless champion of racial and social equity, who put her reputation on the line at a time when, few white Southerners were brave enough to do so. We, think about her in the same light as Sarah and Angelina Grimke, who, preceded her. But Smith's personal convictions and not the socially accepted political mores of her time were her North Star. And so we are especially pleased to have this connection to someone so amazing and inspiring. So I'm going to start a little bit by talking about the lost cause. Lost cause narratives as an obstacle to reparations. After winning the Civil War, the Union, in the person of Republican legislatures and their Black allies, wielded significant influence on public policy across the South. They were in the business of funding public schools, creating access to education for all for the first time, not just Blacks, but also, all white children as well, but also involved in rebuilding the infrastructure of the South. This was an opportunity to create a public sector in the South, which had never existed. But all of these advances were sidelined by the lost cause. That argument, that narrative, that spirit completely sidelined all of those efforts, but not just the ideology, but the way it was practiced. So not only were they silencing Reconstruction and suppressing the success stories of Reconstruction, the lost cause seeded white terror campaigns, which displaced and destroyed Black lives by way of injury and murder. And then we coined this term dismemory to describe the organized and systematic efforts that were made to manipulate and distort the nation's history immediately after the end of the Civil War. This is where we get this whole movement of the erection of thousands of Confederate memorials across the United States by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and most recently, the attempted coup of January 6, 2021. All of these are a through line to the lost cause. So why did the war actually take place? Okay. And we talk about this at length in our book, From Here to Equality, but the answer is to preserve slavery. So I want to read a bit from some of the comments that the Southerners made, the Southern leaders themselves made in real time. So indeed, in 1861, the Vice President of the Confederate States of America, Alexander Stephens, famously connected secession to the maintenance of slavery, an aim he explicitly predicated on a belief in Black inferiority. We reproduce a lengthy portion of Stephens's speech because of its importance. It's raison d'etre for the formation of the Confederacy, but I'm going to read just a portion of his speech. I quote, "Our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite idea from the equality of the races. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth," end quote. So then earlier, in an 1858 speech on the floor of the US Senate, James Henry Hammond, who's a Democrat from South Carolina, advanced what he called the, quote, mudsill theory, end quote, declaring that enslaved Blacks were in a position that best suited their place in the natural social order. So James Henry Hammond said at the time, "In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. That is, a class requiring but a low order of intellect and but little skill. Its requisites are vigor, docility, fidelity. Such a class you must have, or you would not have that other class, which leads progress, civilization, and refinement. It constitutes the very mudsill of society and of political government, and you might as well attempt to build a house in the air as to build either the one or the other, except on this mudsill. Fortunately for the South, she found a race adapted to that purpose to her hand, a race inferior to her own, but eminently qualified in temper, in vigor, in docility, in capacity to stand the climate, to answer all her purposes. We use them for this purpose, and we call them slaves, end quote. Hammond's mudsill theory was an elaborate echo of a position, taken by the author of an 1865 editorial that was published in the Richmond Inquirer. In a perfectly Orwellian definition of liberty, quote, the editorialist made the following terse statement, designating Blacks to hold a position at the bottom of the American hierarchy to ensure appropriate freedoms for whites. Quote, in this country alone does perfect equality of civil and social privileges exist among the white population, and it exists solely because we have Black slaves. Freedom is not possible without slavery.
In the pages of From Here to Equality, particularly in Chapter 5, we give a special emphasis to the attempt to persuade the slaveholders throughout the United States to emancipate their human property via a scheme of compensated emancipation. The premise was to pay the slaveholders to free their human property. And if this had occurred on a national scale, it would have made it possible to avoid the Civil War altogether. But the slaveholding class in the United States refused to do that. And when I use the term slaveholding class, as our book demonstrates, that is a wide spectrum of Americans, particularly in the southern states. It's not a small minority by any means. And so their refusal resulted in the Great War that led to a cataclysmic loss of life. Upwards of 700,000 people died during the course of the Civil War. We have had no comparable event that has led to a similar level of deaths of Americans in a similar span of time until the current pandemic. And so the commitment to slavery was so intense that these individuals were willing to engage in an act of traitorship, to secede from the Union, to go to war for the purposes of preserving their right to own human beings. Now, people frequently say, in the context of making statements in opposition to the case for reparations, that reparations has already been paid by the massive loss of lives that took place during the course of the Civil War. But there's a number of problems with that formulation. The first is the bringing about an end to an atrocity is not the equivalent of compensating the victims of that atrocity for the harms that they have incurred. So stopping a harm is not the same thing as compensating for the effects of the harm. But secondly, the 700,000 deaths count approximately 1/2 or so who were soldiers who were involved in the process of trying to preserve slavery. And then with respect to the Union deaths that took place, we have to recognize that a significant portion of those deaths included the formerly enslaved themselves, who sided with the Union and who chose to fight for their own liberation. And so the end of slavery in the United States and the Union victory was not exclusively a consequence of a gift that was handed to Black Americans. Black Americans were heavily involved in the process of eliminating slavery through their own efforts.
So, one of the responses that we hear often to this whole question of, slavery in the South is that, slaveholding was really confined to a tiny elite of white Southerners, that the majority of white Southerners had no connection to slavery whatsoever. And this is absolutely not the case. By 1860, 8% of all American families enslaved at least one Black body. Now, this is at a time when 21% of the non-Southern states had no slavery. So, the picture of what was happening in the North, had no enslaved, slavery was outlawed, in those places.
21 states.
21 states.
Yeah.
So the picture in the North and the South are very, very different. But we're sort of will speak to, what was happening on the ground in the South. 11 states in the South, at least 20% of white families enslaved Black people, right? So 20 to 29%, you're talking about Arkansas, Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, Texas, Louisiana. The remaining 5 of those states, the Southern states, 34% or higher. Now, when you talk about slaveholding families, so before we're talking about households, when you're talking about slaveholding families, 40% of all of the white slaveholders, all the whites in Florida, in Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi and South Carolina had a fantastic, 40%. 40% of those households enslaved Black people. But when you look specifically at Mississippi and South Carolina, the number jumps to a fantastic 55 and 57% respectively. So slavery was not, an institution that was confined to a tiny elite of Southern whites. And many white Americans across the South were dependent upon slavery for their livelihoods.
Frequently, the argument is made that reparations is not deserved because there was a significant number of Blacks who actually owned human property as well. In a sense, that's actually an irrelevant point because the fact that the atrocity was conducted by some Blacks does not deny the obligation that the nation has, a nation that made slavery legal, the obligation that the nation has to provide compensation for the descendants of those individuals who were damaged and harmed by slavery and unable to transfer resources across the generations to support the living descendants. But in addition, there simply were not very many Black slaveholders in the United States, nor did they hold a significant number or portion of the enslaved population. So we actually relegated this discussion to a footnote in From Here to Equality, but I want to share the content with you. We say the following, excuse me. Excuse me. The best available estimates indicate that 3,000 free Blacks owned 20,000 people in 1860, approximately 0.5% of the 4 million enslaved persons. The 3,000 slaveholding Blacks themselves constituted less than 1% of the 477,000 free Blacks in the United States. So the scale of Black slaveholding was marginal. And frequently people point out that in some instances, Blacks who owned other Blacks had actually purchased their own family members for the purposes of giving them a better life, even though they would technically classify it as enslaved people.
So we're talking next about, slavery being such a long time ago. People say, why are you bringing that up? And we would ask, well, why are we bringing up the Confederacy? And these things were hand in hand. You can't just draw a little line and say we're going to talk about one part of history, but not not the other part. And they were inextricably locked and inextricably linked, these two things.
So the folks who are claiming their Confederate heritage and the like, in the present moment, are talking very much about the events that occurred when slavery took place.
Exactly. But when you think about the generational distance to the period of enslavement, it's not a really long stretch. In my own family, my maternal grandmother, Harriet Taliaferro Mitchell, is the daughter of someone who was enslaved. So, that makes me the third generation in that branch of my family. On my father's side, I am the fourth generation out from slavery. So, it's not really that far. One of the consultants who we quote extensively in From Here to Equality is Hortense McClinton, who is an amazing, 102 years old today, who is the daughter of a slave. Her father, Seabrone King, had been enslaved in Texas, and her family actually had to escape Texas because they were being pursued by whites who were jealous of their intellect, their fortune, and they actually evacuated and moved to a Black town in Oklahoma, to Boley, Oklahoma. So from a generational perspective, slavery wasn't that long ago. But when you also think about, what constitutes this case for slavery, this case for reparations, and for us, it's not slavery solely, but also nearly a century of legal segregation in the United States, which was accompanied by over 100 white massacres. These are situations where, whites almost always motivated by, early, this is during the Reconstruction period when this began, by Black people being actively engaged in politics. And, if they weren't able to intimidate Blacks from voting, then they took more serious measures and, ran people out of town, sometimes burned the Black community to the ground, and murdered Black people as well. And, these are very effective. You scatter the population, and, the voting rolls change dramatically. And you've got Black people who then become refugees. But the property that they left behind, what happens to that? And all too often, we're learning that property, which may also have been a major target of the white mobs to begin with, is then appropriated by some of the very same white mobsters who ran those Black families out of town in the first place.
So the final comment we'd like to make in our portion of the program today is to highlight what we think are the four major pillars of what a reparations program ought to look like. And this is detailed in the final chapter of our book, which we think is one of the more unique contributions of the book. It's very unusual for folks who are engaged in the reparations conversation to actually say, here's how you should do it. And that's one of the things that we attempt to do in the book. And there are four attributes that we would say have to be met for an effective reparations program. The first is the proper designation of who should be eligible for reparations. And we argue that individuals who would be eligible would have to meet two standards. The first is what we refer to as a lineage standard, and the second is an identity standard. The lineage standard has it that an individual must demonstrate that they have at least one ancestor who was enslaved in the United States. And the identity standard has it that for at least 12 years before the onset of a study commission for reparations or the enactment of a reparations plan, whichever comes first, an individual would have to have self-identified as Black, Negro, African American, or Afro-American. The second attribute is that a reparations plan must eliminate the racial wealth gap in the United States. Since the disparity in wealth, and we're talking about wealth, not income, wealth being the net value of your personal property, that the differential in wealth between Blacks and whites is the best economic indicator of the cumulative effects over time of the atrocities that we've been talking about, ranging from slavery to legal segregation in the United States, to ongoing discrimination in the United States, as well as the appropriation and seizure of Black-owned property by white terrorists. All of those things play into the existing racial wealth gap, which amounts to approximately $840,000 per household, based upon the latest findings from the 2019 Survey of Consumer Finances from the Federal Reserve. This means in turn that the bill for reparations would require a payment of at least $11 to $12 trillion for the purposes of erasing this wealth differential. The third feature of an effective reparations plan should be direct payments to eligible recipients, in the same way in which other victimized communities have received direct compensation for the atrocities that they have experienced. Whether we're talking about the German government making direct payments to the victims of the Holocaust, or the US government making direct payments to Japanese Americans who were unjustly incarcerated during the course of World War II. The final attribute is that the bill must be met by the federal government. And this is for two reasons. The first reason is that the federal government is the party that's capable of doing this, while other institutions in the United States cannot meet a bill of $11 to $12 trillion. So for example, if we were to take the combined budgets of all the state and local governments in the United States, they amount to $3.1 trillion. So they would have to devote their budgets for 4 consecutive years exclusively to a reparations fund to meet the $11 to $12 trillion threshold. And then the second reason is that the federal government is the culpable party. If we think about all of these atrocities that have built into the creation of the racial wealth gap, it's a consequence of policies that have been pursued by the federal government, as well as the legal and authority framework that the federal government has generated. And so this is what we argue a reparations plan ought to look like. And we have invested a significant amount of time in our book talking about the kinds of complaints and arguments that have been lodged against Black reparations, particularly those that have been lodged by the lineal descendants of the lost cause.
Sadie mentioned a bit this question of local reparations. We're seeing, places like Evanston, Illinois, and Burlington, Vermont, Asheville, North Carolina, coming forth and saying that they are putting in place reparations programs. But when you look carefully at each of those initiatives, you see that there's something, they're not reparations at all. I mean, they're not designed to eliminate the racial wealth gap, which, as Sandy said, is one of the key tenets of any reparations movement from our point of view. They're sort of masquerading as reparations, and we think these are off ramps. These are off ramps reparations, and should be called something like racial equity initiatives, perhaps. But the terminology reparations we feel somewhat proprietary about, and believe it should be reserved for programs that have at their center the elimination of the racial wealth gap for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery.